to begin. Great. Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to our panelists. As I've been saying, we are really trying to make these webinars as participatory as possible, so do engage in the chat. When you do use the chat, make sure you are sending your message to panelists and attendees. It's just great to know where people are calling in from, your name and your organization. And throughout this entire conversation, do use the chat, post questions to one another or responses, any thoughts. It's really helpful. We'll be using this as part of our sort of conclusion and summaries of these webinars. So a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar is going to be recorded. Use the chat, use the Q&A to post questions to our panel. And if you're on Twitter, do use Twitter, use the hashtag #AWorldWithDrugs. Okay, so my name is Clemmy James and I work for Health Poverty Action. The webinar is part of an 8-part series, A World with Drugs, Legal Regulation Through a Development Lens. And this has been brought together by 8 organizations, international organizations, International Drug Policy Consortium, Transform Drug Policy Foundation, Transnational Institute, Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, Institutoria, Interdisciplinary Centre for Cannabis Research, and the Regulation Project. So we will have 4 panelists today and 5 contributions, and then a final 30-minute Q&A. So thank you for joining us. I know that some people will be slightly out of their comfort zone, might not know so much about what we'll be discussing today. So thank you for joining us. So legal regulation of drugs is happening. It's happening around the world. It's not a fairy tale idea, nor is it a slogan on a t-shirt. Drug policy is changing, in part as a growing response to the failures of prohibition and a need to urgently address over 60 years of harm and trauma caused by an enforcement-led approach that has failed to stop the cultivation, production, trafficking, and consumption of drugs. In fact, these have only increased. But unsurprisingly, the moves to legally regulate this multi-million-dollar illicit market is being spearheaded by corporations, which, with very little interrogation as to what these new markets will regulate and protect. The coalition behind this series believes that the development sector has a duty to respond to this moment. And today we are calling on the environmental sector too to place legal regulation firmly on the agenda. Legally regulating drugs has far-reaching benefits for people and planet, but only if the new emerging policies are designed to protect human rights, promote public health, and ensure social and racial justice are placed firmly at the center of this transition. If new regulatory markets are developed without the voices of those most impacted, or without international advocates for social justice and sustainable development, then we will see a corporate takeover that is likely to push the same inequalities, exploitations, and pain that years of prohibition have inflicted all over the world. So today we're looking at the environmental costs of the so-called war on drugs and how legal regulation could mitigate some of these harms if designed in a way that safeguards and protects the environment. I think we're all aware on this call of our collective duty to do what is possible to mitigate climate catastrophe. The common message, however, when we talk about drugs and development together, is that drug cultivation destroys the environment, and therefore we must stop drug cultivation. However, it is not always the cultivation and production of drugs that causes the most harms, but in fact the policies themselves. The prohibitionist approach has promoted crop eradication from the Caribbean, Latin America to Asia, with farmers having their opium poppies, cannabis, and coca plants destroyed manually or through aerial spraying of chemical herbicides. as a part of trying to achieve the UN's vision of a drug-free world. This threatens biodiversity, fuels deforestation, and drives the illicit crop growers to pursue environmentally hazardous methods of production and travel further into forested areas to replant their crops as a vital form of livelihood. Crop eradication very rarely eliminates permanently. It tends to displace or make temporary changes only, and at the same time damages the planet and the communities that rely on these crops. Given the failures of their own measure of success and the harms caused, we believe we need to urgently address the prohibitionist approach to drugs. It's worth reminding ourselves of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals, in particular, number 15, life on land, to sustainably manage forests, ensure conservation of mountain ecosystems, protect biodiversity and natural habitats, and integrate biodiversity into government planning, amongst others. This should be a wake-up call to all working in social and climate justice that under prohibition, these are currently unachievable goals. So we're here today to explore this further and explore whether legal regulation could be a successful policy approach to drugs in repairing some of these harms and creating a more sustainable drugs trade. But also, as these new markets do emerge, how do we ensure that we do not replicate monocultural industrial farming that equally jeopardizes forests, land, water, and soil? So without further ado, let us hear from our speakers. It is my real pleasure today to introduce Junior Spirit Cottle. Spirit has been a real supporter of our series. Spirit is a traditional cannabis grower, an international activist, and the president of the Cannabis Revival Committee. He is calling in today from St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean. Thanks again, Spirit, for sharing your knowledge. Over to you.
Very pleasant good morning, good evening, good night to all the listeners of this special broadcast. Special greetings to my fellow traditional cultivators of prohibited plants, whether they are in Myanmar, in Jamaica, in Colombia, in my own St. Vincent and the Grenadines, wherever you are. Feel assured that you are not alone. Given opportunities like these, I always want or like to appeal to my listeners to have some patience with me because I suffer from a damaged vocal cord and a partial paralysis of my face as a result of a gunshot wound. Now, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a multi-island state located to the east of Barbados, to the north of St. Lucia, and to the south of Grenada, and Grenada in the south, and Trinidad in the south. Together, these islands cover an area of 153 square miles, with St. Vincent being the largest of them all, which is about 133 square miles. St. Vincent itself is very mountainous, with a climate and soil that gives it an advantage for cannabis cultivation. No wonder it is regarded as the second largest producer of cannabis in the region after Jamaica. Conservative official estimates put our traditional cultivators at around 1,500, not to include many youths who journey to the mountains to help in land preparation and at harvest time. Most of the island's cannabis are produced on very high slopes, prone to erosion, and in some cases, in the nation's most critical watershed on which the population depends for their domestic water and for the generation of electricity. By their involvement in cannabis, growers have been able to provide for their families in a way that they have never been able to do before. But unfortunately, their actions have been the source of serious environmental degradation as far as the forest is concerned. Their actions have caused serious depletion of our nation's forests, pollution of our rivers by the use of dangerous agricultural chemicals, grain landslides at the upper echelons of some of our most critical watersheds. Apart from this environmental degradation, cannabis cultivation had by the late 1980s, early 1990s onwards, made St. Vincent and the Grenadines the largest supplier of cannabis to the region, namely CARICOM, thereby singling it out as one of the causes of the grain crime rate and tough wars in some of our neighboring territories. This resulted in an American-led eradication exercise supported by the region's security forces in our forests. The use of American helicopters for the landing of troops rather than bringing an end to the cultivation made matters worse by forcing our growers to the higher elevations, which offered more security but increased the risk of soil erosion. Protests against such eradication and resilience on the part of our growers forced the government to come up with a new approach. As a result, in 2001, the Forestry Department in the Ministry of Agriculture initiated a project called the Integrated Forest Management and Development Project in an attempt to reduce the deforestation, in which traditional cultivators were invited to participate, having been regarded as a major stakeholder. The project itself had three components. One, strengthening the forestry department. Two, the establishment of a project management unit. And three, providing alternative livelihood. Under the latter component, cannabis cultivators were employed to reforest lands which they themselves had deforested. There was a policy of tolerance in those areas which was being reforested and which, to some extent, allowed the employees to grow their cannabis without being eradicated. Also, which for the first time encouraged a level of cooperation between forest guards and the growers. Growers were paid a mere $10 a day, which from the perspective of an alternative was not sustainable. In the process, the growers became more educated in protecting the forest, and for a while became the principal guardians of that particular watershed. As ambitious as the project was, it didn't meet the expectation for a number of reasons. One, insufficient or lack of funding for the alternative component. Two, unsustainable economic option. Three, the location of the project management unit within a government department rather than on neutral territory, thereby allowing growers to feel more free and at ease in their relation to the project itself. And 4, the lack of participation of growers or their representatives from the lowest to the highest level. And by the highest level, I mean at the level of the oversighting body. Finally, in December 2018, the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines passed the medical cannabis and amnesty laws. Many growers welcomed the move, while many did not. And the latter happened because they weren't sufficiently educated about the benefits of such laws to they and their families. Also, years of distrust made them continue to distrust. One of the benefits of such laws, however, was that they were encouraged to constantly move away. It encouraged them to constantly move away from the higher echelons of our forests to lower lying areas, an important contribution to climate change. Socially, our prisoners have seen less persons on cannabis charges. This also had an impact on the reduction of crime. Currently, things are moving. Growers are increasingly being registered because of COVID, the impact has slowed. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Spirit. It is always a privilege to hear you speak and to learn from you. I don't think we can move these conversations forward without input from growers like yourself and your vision and experience. So thank you very much. Now I would like to invite María Alejandra Vélez, who is speaking from Colombia today. Maria is director of the Center for Studies on Security and Drugs, associate professor at the Faculty of Economics of Universidad de los Andes, founding member of the Center for Sustainable Development Goals for Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Clemi, for your invitation and your introduction. I'm gonna quickly share the screen. Please let me know if you can see it now. Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna share some thoughts moving towards a green drug policy agenda. I have put in the title. And the first thing that I would like to share with you is that 90% of the cocaine consumed in the world is produced from Coca Crops in Colombia. This is the case, even though the so-called war against drugs that have included so far, as you have said in the introduction, aerial fumigation, manual forced eradication, and crop substitution. In fact, we are right now again discussing the idea of starting again the aerial fumigation. For the last 2 decades, aerial fumigation involved 1,700,000 hectares of illicit coca crops had been fumigated. And despite all these efforts, as you can see in the graphs that show the evolution of coca crops, we are far away from reducing the coca crops in Colombia. Right now, for data from the last year, but it's the most current data, we have 154,000 hectares of coca crops, which is the 9, the 9 crops in the country in terms of hectares, and it involves more than 102,000 families. So we are really worried about this idea of the drug policy as a balloon effect. That means that forced eradication pushes the agricultural frontier to more environmental sensitive places. So aerial fumigation may be reduced in the short run the coca crops in one place with a lot of environmental, health, and social effects, but it also pushes the agricultural frontier. So this is, I think, one of the most important effects of the drug policy right now. And in Colombia, 30% of the coca crops right now are in very important environmental areas. 4.4% in national parks, 9% in collective properties of indigenous communities, 60% in collective properties of Afro-Colombian communities. You can imagine that all these places are places very important in terms of biodiversity, are basically our most important forest. And as you can see on in the map, these are all in red dots are where the coca crops are located for 2018, but it's basically in the same areas today. We have seen an increase since 2013, especially in indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. So perhaps this is one of the most important things in environmental terms, is that coca crops are being pushed to places that are very sensitive in environmental terms. Of course, we have to say that there is a complex relationship between coca and deforestation. It's not always a direct driver, and there is a lot of regional heterogeneity. But by 2017, according to official figures, 24% of deforested areas in Colombia were associated with coca crops. But I will say that more important than the direct driver of deforestation is an indirect driver of deforestation. So the logic is that, you know, eradication pushes the coca into pushes the agricultural frontier, and the coca, it just allows the arrival of other activities, legal or illegal, roads, etc. So this is a first point. A second point is that when the coca crops arrive to these very sensitive environmental areas, then most of the alternative development programs and most of the crop substitution program has an exclusively agricultural focus, which is a mistake given the environmental sensitivity of these areas. So I have here like 3 ideas that I would like to discuss with you, and very briefly, I know that time is almost over, on how to just rethink this drug policy agenda with an environmental and community focus. First, we need to start thinking in illegal markets as a jointly problem. So for example, 43% of the national territory has gold exploitation overlapping with coca crops. And all the focus is in coca crops when those 2 markets go together. Most of the production of mining, for example, is illegal. And just like the coca crop farmers, most of the informality sometimes understood as criminality, which of course is a mistake. For many ethnic communities, mining is part of their cultural identity. And as I said, it overlaps with coca crops in many territories. So I think we have to start thinking to intervene both markets jointly as part of substitution policy, and thinking to formalize, certify, and achieve access to gold value chains, which is something that could happen if we eventually regulate coca crops. We can actually have some traceability of these markets. Second, I think we need to start thinking about how to have a meeting point between the environmental policy and the drug policy agenda. And one instrument could be payment for ecosystem services. For those of you who are not familiar with that, payment for ecosystem services is a voluntary transaction in which an environmental service is purchased by someone that needs that services. And the most important thing is conditionality. Several impact evaluations suggest that it has a positive effect, and we have more than 550 PES programs in 60 countries all across the world. And I think that payment for ecosystem services can support the transitions to legality, complement substitutions programs, and contributes to a preventive logic with both community eradication commitments and commitments in environmental terms. Because just as like coffee, coca will keep pushing the agricultural frontier in these very important places. And I think that payment for ecosystem services will allow us to have an impact on income of communities while reducing the environmental impact. And third, I think a key point here is the role of community resistance. When you look at, for example, the Pacific region, where right now 16% of the coca crops are located, you see that some communities don't have coca crops, and don't have coca crops because it's also important to say that coca crops doesn't arrive alone. Arrive with illegal armed groups, arrived with criminal groups that is threatening the territory. And some communities have actually opposed to the entrance of illicit crops. I'm not going to go through this, but what we have shown and we have doing research about is that those communities who are opposing to coca crops and also to African palm is not because coca, it's just because anything that threatens the territory has a lot of social capital. So I think we need to start investment in this community organization capacity so these type of global markets are not threatening the territory. So I will end with these three ideas. We need to jointly address illicit markets. We need to seek energies with environmental agenda and policy, and payment for ecosystem services is one idea. And I think we need to start strengthening the community organization, investing in the organizational capacity of communities and also in the local leaderships. And I think that while regulation happen, which is something that is not going to happen soon, we need to start sort of greening the drug policy agenda. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Maria, Alejandra. That was very comprehensive and fascinating presentation. It's really interesting to hear how entangled where prohibition is to blame, and it's very helpful. I think that Lorenzo is going to speak to a lot of this actually. So I'm really pleased to invite our third speaker, also a fellow Colombian, Lorenzo Ubri, who is actually calling from London. Hi, I'm also in London. Lorenzo is a master's student at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Until September, he was, however, the economic advisor of Colombia's Senator Ivan Maluranda from the Green Party, and the person in charge of the recently introduced bill to the Colombian Senate to regulate the cocaine market in Colombia. Very exciting. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kimi, and thanks for this invitation. Can you please put the presentation? Yeah, great. So after Maria Alejandra's explanation of the environmental consequences that the war on drugs has had in Colombia, I would like to focus, even though, as Maria Alejandra said, this is not going to happen anytime soon, I would like to focus on the potential benefits of coca and cocaine regulation in Colombia. Please next. So, and I would like to focus in particular to the bill we introduced last August this year by a group of 20 senators from 8 different parties that seek to regulate all stages of the market of the coca plant and cocaine market. So to do that, next, the idea is to first tell you about why our regulation could contribute to mitigate the impact of coca and cocaine on the environment, both at the coca cultivation stage, but also at the production and consumption of cocaine stage. Then I would like to focus on how this bill plans to do this concretely, and then focus on some of the caveats and limitations and why, even though this is our first step, this is not going to solve all problems. So next, and let's start first with why could regulation contribute to mitigate the impact of coca and cocaine on the environment. So if we focus first on the coca cultivation stage, as Maria Alejandra said, coca cultivation is thought to be one of the drivers of deforestation in Colombia. It's not the main one, but it's one of the important ones. And this happens because farmers need to go beyond the agricultural frontier in order to hide from the state. So in a scenario where we regulate the coca crops, then this will not happen, since you will have coca farmers within the agricultural frontier. They will not have any incentive to move beyond that. So this will reduce deforestation on the one hand, and on the other hand, this would ensure that coca are planted where they are supposed to be planted. So it will ensure an ordered use of agricultural land. Next, please. So in addition, if we regulate the coca market, the cultivation of coca, the coca leaf, then you would also ensure that coca farmers are included in the formal agricultural sector. This will have two benefits. First, it will ensure that these farmers have access to technical assistance on sustainable agricultural practices, which also would have a positive effect on the environment. And it will ensure that these farmers are subject to environmental regulations and controls. Today, because they are illegal, there is absolutely no way that the government can ensure that these coca crops are grown in a sustainable manner. Also, and I think this is an indirect effect, but it's important to mention too, since this will be regulated, we will not have the risk. This is not happening now, but it has happened in the past and it will happen in the near future. We will not have the risk of aerial spraying of glyphosate, which also has a very, very negative impact on the environment. And last, if we regulate the coca and cocaine market, we expect to reduce the sources of funding of these armed groups, and that would weaken them. So it would be easier for the state to take control of these areas that are currently under control of illegal armed groups, and therefore ensure that the government has an active and effective control on these protected areas, therefore protecting them against potential cases of deforestation, for example. So this is about the coca cultivation side. Next, please. So moving to the production and consumption side, if we regulate the production and consumption of cocaine, we would also this would also have positive effects on the environment for two reasons. First, it will reduce the contamination of water sources. As maybe you know, today cocaine is transformed, so the coca leaf is transformed into cocaine in laboratories, inside the jungle or in the rural areas, in very remote places, where there is absolutely no way to make sure that the chemicals that are being used are handled in an appropriate manner. So what happens is that all these chemicals are thrown into the rivers, contaminating the water sources. If we regulate this process of transformation from coca to cocaine, this will not happen. And last, when we think about consumption, we also hope that if consumption is also regulated, we will not have all these side effects of having inappropriate disposal of residuals and packages in the sewage system. This is like a small minor effect, but I think it's still worth mentioning. Next, please. So this is about like the general idea of why regulating could have a positive effect on the environment. Moving to what the bill is seeking, I would like to first, again, focus on the provisions about coca cultivation that could actually improve environmental outcomes, and then focus on the production and consumption side. So regarding the coca cultivation, the idea in the bill, one of the ideas is that cultivation will be forbidden in environmentally protected areas. Again, to make sure that we reduce and mitigate the impact on deforestation. So as Alejandra was explaining, most or many of these farmers are actually growing in these environmentally sensitive areas. So the idea is to have a comprehensive census of all coca farmers to identify and offer alternative to those who are in these environmentally sensible areas, and offer them alternatives. This alternative doesn't mean they have to like grow coca within the agricultural frontier. They could also grow other crops, because as Alejandra said, they are not all interested in growing coca, but that would be an option. If they are interested in other crops, that would also be possible. Also, the bill includes provisions to make sure that the government assists coca farmers with environmentally sustainable farming techniques, and also establishes an order to the government to secure land property rights for these farmers. Next, please. On the production and consumption side, so as I said previously, water consumption, the contamination of water sources is a big problem. But if we regulate, in the bill, we are ensuring and making sure that the government provides licenses to research centers, universities, and pharmaceutical companies to transform the coca leaf into cocaine. So when the government gives this license to these research centers or universities, it will set some minimum environmental standards to ensure that the chemicals used and the waste produced is handled in an appropriate manner. Also, the government is expected to help farmers to create their own fair trade labels and certificates of origin. Something like similar to what happened with diamonds in Africa, for example. So here we will have like blood-free coca product-based products. So the idea here is that farmers will have an incentive to grow coca in an environmentally friendly way. And last, with the revenue collected from the sale of coca-based products, this could be cocaine, but not also. It also can be tea, beverages, all sort of products based on coca. The idea is that the revenue that the government collects from that, a portion of that will be used to ensure that the government has enough funding to implement these programs I mentioned to ensure that coca farming is made in a sustainable way. So next, please. This is not going to solve all problems, like it's not a silver bullet. And as María Alejandra rightly pointed out, so even if we are able to regulate the drugs market in Colombia, other illegal activities will be there that also have damaging effects on the environment, for example, gold mining. This will not solve, at least in the near future, all the tensions between local communities and new settlers. And maybe the most important caveat is that if no action is taken in consumer countries, then a large part of coca and cocaine will be produced illegally, and this will still have the environmental effects, impacts that we mentioned. But we think that we need to start from somewhere, and we think Colombia, given its history and its failure with the war on drugs, is a good place to start from. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Lorenzo. That was really inspiring, I think, for a lot of our audience to know that policies like yours are firmly part of the political process. Will no doubt be an inspiration to advocates and hopefully an example to other countries, and that perhaps this is in reach. So we are now going to come to our fourth contribution, unfortunately. So this is from Kenza Afahai Afasahai, and unfortunately she couldn't make the webinar. However, her contribution is really vital to this area of work. So we decided to read a piece from her report. She is the founder of Cannabis Suds Network and lecturer at University of Bordeaux. She divides her time between Morocco and France. So she recently produced a paper called The RIF and California, Environmental Violence in the Era of New Cannabis Markets. So this piece is an exploration of the harmful environmental impacts that occur in legal regulation. And she explores what is happening in Morocco and California, and explores the predatory and exploitative behaviors of the new cannabis corporations who are harming people and land for profit. I'm just going to read a really short extract. I think what's really important here is to bear in mind that it doesn't really matter whether something is legal or illegal. It is often the environment that is being harmed and absent from consideration. So here we go. In southern countries, as amplified by the RIF, large landowners exploit their labour force, which is made up of landless agricultural workers, women and farmers. However, this is also true of California. These two territories have suffered at the hands of humans with their machinery, agricultural technology, overexploitation of fertilizers and pesticides. Environmental changes in the context of cannabis cultivation show us how the process of destruction has accelerated in recent years and echoes a more global and globalized ecological crisis. The environmental impact from regulatory vacuums and prohibition has been compounded by new legislation, which has turned a deaf ear to prominent voices calling for environmental sustainability. Instead, it has focused on the millions or even billions of dollars that the cannabis industry has generated for large corporations. which have in turn been able to influence state administrations and regulatory advisory boards and push for less stringent environmental policies and regulation. I think it's a real reminder that this isn't just about legally regulating, this is about the type of regulation that we collectively need to bring forward and be part of designing. And for this, we need to really work across sectors and work together. So I am now going to introduce our final presentation, and that is from Katie Sandwell from the Transnational Institute, working in the Agrarian and Environmental Justice Programs. Katie is ringing in from the Netherlands today. And Katie is going to zoom out a little for us from this particular intersection of drugs and the environment, and give us some context moving forward when we think about legislation and legal regulation from the wider agricultural reform movement. Thank you. Over to you, Katie.
Thanks very much, Clemmy, and thanks to everyone for those really fascinating presentations. As Clemmy mentioned, I would like to today talk a little bit to all of you about the risks that are associated with certain styles of regulation. And in particular, I want to draw on my own experience and my own work with both the global food sovereignty movement and with sustainable agriculture movements around the world. So as a few of the presenters have touched on, and as Clemmy mentioned, industrial agriculture, so large-scale, monocultural, pesticide-intensive, fertilizer-intensive agriculture, is associated with a number of major environmental harms. And as Clemmy points out, this is referring to fully legal and regulated agriculture. Industrial agriculture today, as a sector, is responsible for about 24% of all of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. It's also responsible for a number of other environmental consequences, like dead zones in ocean spaces resulting from fertilizer runoff, like desertification, depletion of depletion of aquifers, so underground water deposits, soil degradation, damage to watersheds, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem destruction. But what's important to keep in mind or to understand here is that not all agricultural systems are created equal. And there's a growing body of evidence emerging and of activism around this, that in fact, small scale farming, and especially what we can call agroecological farming, or farming that's practiced with in kind of an alignment with local ecosystems and using traditional techniques, is dramatically less damaging to its environment. And actually, more than that, it can be a positive factor. So small scale agroecological farms can help to absorb carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it back up in soils, can help to restore damaged soils and watersheds, refill aquifers, protect biodiversity, and regenerate ecosystems. The reason I think this is so relevant to our conversation here today is because industrial agriculture didn't emerge naturally or coincidentally. It's a product of a whole series of regulations that have helped to shape it. And across the board, regulation shapes the way the products are produced and who profits from producing them. So as we come to think about regulating currently illicit crops, and this is of course especially urgent in the case of cannabis, we need to think about what kind of regulation could be suitable for that. And I'll say that some historical evidence and some of the current kind of cases in the cannabis markets suggest that there's a risk in the movement from prohibition to legal markets, that there can be a huge increase in the kind of concentration and scale. So for example, when the US ended its alcohol prohibition in the 20th century, within 5 years, it went from being this very regional, diversified, illicit market in alcohol to having just 4 companies who were controlling 80% of all of the distilled alcohol market. So a really very concentrated market with a few big, powerful players. As I say, there seems to be some movement already in that direction in the domain of cannabis. So I think we want, what I'd like to bring here is a couple of lessons from sustainable food movements on how we might try to shape regulations that protect small scale farmers and then create the possibility that those farmers can become real stewards and act as a force for environmental protection, rather than, as a number of people have suggested, a number of the presenters have suggested, rather than contributing to these environmental damages as right now. And I think the first kind of critical point that seems relevant here is that we need to recognize the value of farmers' knowledge. So around the world, small-scale farmers and traditional producers have really important knowledge of their lands and their ecosystems. So when we think about development, we need to think about how we can work with that knowledge and not against it. And of course, in a number of cases, as Spirit was mentioning, that probably does include strengthening farmers' understandings on certain points and working to develop their capacities and their understanding. But there are kind of powerful models of how we can do that that's not about coming in and replacing that agroecological knowledge and that kind of locally grounded knowledge of their ecosystems with greenhouses and technological and capital intensive production methods, but instead using kind of models of peer-to-peer learning or horizontal exchanges between farmers to build kind of contextually grounded knowledge of more sustainable techniques in their region. A prominent example in food systems has been the Campesino a Campesina program. The second point, and I see this as kind of related, is I think we need to try to think about how we can design regulation and markets that will foster farmers' autonomy. So that is to say that will let farmers engage with markets on their own terms. So in the 1980s and 1990s, just as another historical example, many farmers converted to or were pushed to convert to the production of coffee or sometimes coca or some cocoa, sometimes bananas, but quite high value crops for export. Those markets then entered a kind of boom and bust cycle. So many farmers were impoverished by that kind of dependency on a single product and often on a single exporter who they were kind of bound to and couldn't go independently from. So when we think about trying to design legal markets for cannabis or for coca and other crops, we need to think about how do we make sure that producers are not dependent on a single crop and especially not on a single buyer. So I think cooperatives and producer associations can be one important part of that, but we also need to situate this in a kind of broader discussion of how specialized should agriculture be, what other livelihood options can be and should be available to people, how involved can they be in processes like post-harvest processing and so on. The third point I wanted to touch on, which also feeds into this, is how do we connect farmers and consumers a bit more directly? So what the global food and sustainable agriculture movements have found is that farmers are really vulnerable when they're isolated from the people who buy their product, or when they can only engage with or reach those people through a very powerful intermediary. So there have been a number of models explored to try to kind of undermine that or to try to work around that. Community-supported agriculture is a small-scale local one, and that's where people directly buy shares in a farm and participate in farming with the farmer. And that's a little bit mirrored by the Cannabis Social Club movement in Europe and in Uruguay. Lorenzo also mentioned a few other examples of designated, protected designations of origin, fair trade labels, and other kinds of certification schemes like that. All of these we can talk about kind of helping to close a geographic distance between producers and consumers, so that producers are less isolated and so that consumers can give support for sustainable initiatives. And then finally, so I'm running out of time, I wanted to say that across the board in designing these kinds of policies and regulations, there is just no replacement for democracy. So what's essential is to involve small-scale producers, and especially those who have been marginalized or criminalized by prohibition regimes, at every stage of the discussion about how regulation is designed and how regulation is implemented.
Wow, Katie, thank you. I wish you could go to every primary school in the world and give that presentation, because I think it's really inspiring to understand what really works, and hearing you talk about the small scale participation, diversification, Of course, there's so much logic in what you're explaining to us. So thank you. I learned a lot from your presentation just now. So I just wanted to remind us all of the very purpose of this webinar, but also of the series that we've been putting on, is that drug policy is being sort of siloed and is a planet spinning around all these other social justice urgent areas of work. And we really, very much coming from the development perspective of how do we integrate and begin to work together so that some of these issues that you're talking about, Katie, are very much at the table. We were sort of mentioning about, Lorenzo, you were talking about creating funds that could be then used to support people. Like, where is the tax justice in these new regulatory markets? How does the trade mean that? How can these trades mean that farmers do understand who's buying their product and do have that connection, rather than these enormous organizations that stand in their way and disempower their livelihood? So yeah, the series is very much about exploring how we can put the development perspective or the global equity perspective very much at the heart of these questions, but also from the other movements. So from the environmental movement, you know, bringing drug policy onto the agenda is absolutely critical now. And I think we can learn that there's lots of illogical things that are happening right now under prohibition. So we have a few questions. Yeah, please, as participants of this webinar, if you have any questions for our panel, do use the Q&A to ask anything. We have a few questions. I've got one question. So what could be the development gains? It might already have covered it, but it'd be great to sort of get in there a bit more. What could be the development gains from an environmental perspective if we did legal regulation well? So what are the development gains? Maybe Maria and Alejandra, you might be able to answer that or give some thoughts on this question.
Yeah, well, some thoughts. I think several. The first one is that prohibition in general has prevent more research about, for example, the enormous property of coca leaves, and I'm going to focus in coca production. So this is like a plant that hasn't been studied at all with all their properties in terms of medicine, nutrition, well, many things, agricultural functions, etc. So I think that prohibition in general have prevented really an enormous program of research about that. And I'm going to share here one of the papers that we have done about all the enormous potential that Coca Crops has and that we haven't developed because of prohibition. Like in the labs in the universities, we cannot have coca leaves to study because it's prohibited. So there has been all the research that had been conducted around cannabis that we need more, but we are even far away with coca crops. Second, I think that legal markets allow us, as Katie and Lorenzo mentioned, allow us to have a traceability of where is that coca crops coming from, if it's produced in an environmental, social friendly way, etc. When you have an illegal market, there is no way that you can make a traceability of that product. So I think that with traceability, you can prevent more environmental damage. Of course, you have coffee, which is totally legal, and if coffee is produced in an unsustainable way, it also have impacts as cattle ranching and other products. But at least when it's legal, you can have some traceability and access value chains that are willing to pay something extra if you do it in a sustainable way. So traceability is another gain. And a third one is that, well, basically producer countries and vulnerable communities are the ones facing the cost of prohibition because of all the policies against coca crops production, but also because all the violence and conflict that is associated to a legal market. So I think regulation will also bring a more safety environment to these communities that allowed also environmental leaders to be able to protect the forest, etc. Right now, there is a lot of threats to environmental leaders who are against Coca Crops expansion in their territories. So I think I will say those three for now.
Thank you very much. Katie, did you have anything? I feel like that. Did you have anything to add? I know there was elements in your presentation, but was there anything to add to that question?
I mean, Maria gave, I think, a super brilliant and comprehensive answer to that. I do think one other dimension that's maybe worthwhile pointing out in terms of the damages of prohibition is that it's also, of course, an enormous damper on the kind of farmer-to-farmer exchanges, which I was talking about. So on the one hand, we haven't had the chance to develop formal scientific research about the possible benefits of the crops, but there also hasn't been any real way to facilitate farmers to collectively develop more sustainable production methods and to kind of strengthen their livelihoods in that way. And then the other point, and I think this has been touched upon by everyone really, but is that these kinds of environmental damages from deforestation to other kinds of environmental exploitation are almost always, I think I would say, or are very commonly kind of crimes of economic desperation. So people are being driven either by prohibition and by the law, as people were saying, beyond the agricultural frontier and into ecologically sensitive zones, and or people are being driven to those same things by economic desperation and by a total lack of opportunities and of livelihoods. So if legal markets can be structured in a way that they help to build kind of stable, sustainable livelihoods for people and for communities, then I think there could be an enormous benefit there as well in terms of reducing that level of desperation.
Thank you, Katie. So we've got a question from our audience, from Hilary O'Hare. And Hilary is asking, what is the risk to the environment if this doesn't happen, if we do not legally regulate? Are there global or localized predictions of the ecological damage if things don't change? Great question, Hilary. I wonder, Spirit, if maybe you could give us some context of if we leave things as they are and we do not change anything, what are your thoughts on the environmental perspective from your community in St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
Well, certainly we'll have more forest cover will be damaged. Our water will become more polluted. Our fishes will depend on the coral reef. As a result of the siltation from deforestation, coral reef will be damaged. The air we breathe will be less healthy, and a number of other environmental fallout. Eventually, we will not be able to have a sustainable way of livelihood.
Yeah. Thank you. Lorenzo, do you have anything to add to that? That's slightly frightening question, but very important one to really think about what we're facing here.
Yes, well, I think Maria Alejandra went through some of them in her presentation, but basically that would be like what's happening right now. So it's not going to change. It's just what's happening right now. And what's happening right now is that you have, at least in the case of Colombia that I know, you have 24% of the deforestation that is caused by coca plantations. You have 60% of coca crops beyond the agricultural frontier. You have more than 6,000 hectares of coca crops in national parks. And you have the imminent risk of having aerial spraying of glyphosate, which has been found to cause dermatological and respiratory problems. It has also been found to increase the number of natural abortions. It contaminates the water sources. It also reduces biodiversity. So this is what's happening now, and it does have a very negative effect in the environment.
And and maybe this is a bit open to the whole panel. What are our barriers as advocates, as academics, as activists? What are our barriers for this intersection becoming a real force and making change happen at the speed at which the corporations are legally regulating? Does anyone have anything to respond to in terms of what these? I mean, one major one is that this is led internationally, and so in terms of our country's contexts, it's all very well lobbying our own governments and making changes, which does have huge impact. I mean, Canada, Portugal, Uruguay, Bolivia are used as real examples of progressive drug policy reform. But internationally, prohibition is upheld by the UN. And so there is a real frustration, hesitation, and I feel from the different sectors, perhaps still very difficult to know how to navigate this area that is shrouded in stigma still. And I think what we've learned from this webinar very much is really understanding that this is people's livelihoods, and we need to really stop ignoring this fact. I had another question actually, which was actually, I'm not sure, but the environmental movement at the moment is really pioneered or really being, the energy is in the youth. And we are really seeing in the last couple of years, young people run with climate change, climate justice. I wonder whether the panel has any thoughts on how we utilize this energy in terms of our intersection of the environment and drug policy reform, and whether you have any thoughts of engaging young people in this advocacy. Maria, Alejandra.
Yeah, let me start by saying that we have to understand, and I think young people will understand it better now, that supply follows demand. So as long as there's going to be demand for a substance, which is going to happen, but because we have to live with it and take it from another perspective, there is going to be production. So it's clear that some countries right now are taking the good steps of having drug consumption as an agenda of public health, which is supposed to be there, but you're still criminalizing the producers, which are not the ones who are necessarily becoming rich at all. So now that we are moving to this consumption side of the problem as a health issue, the same, we should start moving this production side as a rural development issue and take it from there. Otherwise, the production side will only help to start, deforestation, as we have just discussed. And also, we have to keep in mind that the environmental impacts of, for example, Coca Crops production are not only for Coca Crop production. You cannot think about Coca Crop production as an isolated market. It's just integrated with other markets, and rapidly illegal and legal things are in the same cycle. So the money from Coca Crop production, in the next year, it's a cattle ranching. So we need to start thinking all this as a one problem, as a how to prevent the agricultural frontier being pushed. And I think that the only way to basically fix that is to vote correctly, because this is going to be part of what the Congress in each of the countries are going to make the decisions. No? So it's not about only consuming fair trade or consuming environmentally sounds good. I think it's also about, for young people, about voting for those people who are going to move this agenda forward.
Danny,
Yes, Spirit.
yeah, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and
Yeah.
many other countries, young people congregate a lot on the blocks, but sometimes, and these blocks are sort of informal institutions. Sometimes we ourselves, we talk down against young people. We don't visit the blocks. We have to meet them on their own turf. We have to get into their culture, not in a negative way. We have to, they like music, we have to get into the music and encourage them and make sure that the music has the right content. We have to make sure of that. Use the form and introduce a content that is educational. We have to sensitize them. They love calypso, we have to get into calypso. They love reggae, we have to get into the reggae and make sure they get the right messaging.
I really, yeah, I think that I love your form of activism, Spirit. I think that's the vision, and I agree. And I think that it's a real in terms of reaching out in solidarity to the climate justice movement at the moment. It's really, really inspiring to see so many young people run with this, and perhaps with climate change, it's you know, we're all a fruit bowl, and all of our issues are fruits in the bowl, and we impact each other. And I think that that's what we, within the social justice movements and global equity movements, we really need to start understanding and having the. I know that it's very difficult because we're also restricted by our funding and what we're told to work on, but an understanding and a development of how our areas of work interconnect and impact one another is really important. So have another question's come in. What messages do you have for people advocating for legal regulation in their own countries on the environment? So what messages does the panel have for people advocating for legal reg in their own countries? And I think we've understood from this webinar that in different countries, there's very, very different contexts within where we're at with prohibition and the new emerging legal markets. But are there any messages on how to advocate within the legal regulation with focus on the environment? Lorenzo, I wonder if maybe you should answer this one, because you've really pushed the boundaries here by writing this draft bill.
Sure. So I think, as both Alejandra and Spirit mentioned, I think it's important to like broaden the lens through which we look at this. So I think we usually look at this when you are in the production country, you look at this through the security lens. When you are in the consumer country, you look at it through like the moral or maybe the health lens. But I think if we look at it as you are doing it with these seminars, through the development lens, through the environmental lens, through the health lens. So all these will help to have more people interested. So maybe someone is not very interested in security studies, but they might be very interested in the environment, or they might be very interested in development. So if you broaden the lens, then you will have more people, and if you have more people, then you will have more support. That's one. The other thing that I keep thinking about these things is that I feel the movement is very good at saying what's the problem. And so I think now we have a consensus of what's wrong. And so everyone is campaigning to explain that the war on drugs has failed. But I think now we need to explain, so what's the alternative, how to do it? And I think that's where we are a bit weak. And that's why I think opening the debate to the what's next, how to do it, would also like be beneficial.
And just to add to that, I think that the vision and it's really, really important, whether we're doing public facing campaigns, or whether we're doing advocacy or moving this debate forward in terms of whether we're activists or academics. But I think we can absolutely guarantee that behind the scenes, this is being pushed forward by corporations, and we're not at the table very often. And I think this is why this is the moment where we really need to start ensuring that this development lens and thinking about the environment and tax justice and Indigenous rights really is how we begin to understand this new opportunity for writing legislation. So we have another question that's come in from our attendees, and it's from Dania Putri. How can we ensure that any environmental policies and practices are made based on democratic and participatory processes, and not just become another form of oppressive control of small-scale farmers and workers who can't easily comply with environmental standards? Yeah, great question. Katie, I wonder if you wanted to, I think this is really interesting, because what comes with legal regulation is often licenses and standards that aren't able to be met. And so the participation of impacted communities and farmers at the start, so we're not retrospectively integrating what's possible, but very much at the beginning. Katie, do you have an answer to Dania's question?
Not a single simple answer, but a couple of thoughts about it. It's a very tricky question. And it's a tricky question kind of across the field of sustainable agriculture as well, as to how we encourage a kind of grassroots and participatory movement towards more sustainable practices. I think, to me, a really core kind of consideration starting out is that we need to recognize and be very aware of and attentive to the kind of power imbalances that already exist in the field, right? So that these major corporations who are stepping into the field have this ability to easily meet certain kinds of regulations, and have the ability to invest a lot of upfront capital and have the technological skills and international connections to navigate all these systems really a lot more easily than small producers will. So there are a couple kind of different things that we can do to try to address and to mitigate those imbalances, I think. I think one kind of important area of the conversation on this is talking about different kinds of kind of special measures or special processes or special kind of scale appropriate systems that are put in place, especially to make sure that people who have been marginalized and excluded and criminalized by prohibition are able to now benefit from the system. So I know that in the US, some of this has taken the form of a conversation about drug war reparations. And sort of at a minimum, making sure that, for example, past criminal convictions linked with drug possession or drug production don't prevent you from receiving a license, which currently is the case in a lot of jurisdictions. But going a step further than that, also trying to provide specific targeted support to those communities who have been marginalized. So I think those kinds of, it's a little bit of like I characterize that as a bit of like an add-on to the regulatory structure, but that can be an important compensation for overall tendencies. But then I think the bigger and kind of more difficult part of it is to go beyond the add-on and to try to make sure that your policies are designed in an actual participatory process, and that people who are traditional producers and who have been part of the illicit market are involved really from the get-go in the design of regulation. And that to me is absolutely critical. And the kind of flip side of that, complement to that, is to put some kinds of limitations on the power of corporations and corporate actors to shape and to influence policy. So I see those as really two sides of the same process. So it's not enough to get everybody a seat at the table if people have totally different amounts of power when they get up from the table. You need to put in place kind of measures to balance the relative strength of their inputs. But maybe Maria has some more concrete suggestions.
Yeah, Maria, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that that's a very important question, and this is the one of the threats that are really happening right now. For example, with the cannabis permits in Colombia, all the people who access to the cannabis permits to produce cannabis for medical reasons are entrepreneurs and companies, and none of the traditional cannabis cultivators, still illegal, were able to get to those license. And it's also happening with gold, right? Most of the traditional gold miners who are doing it at small scale, they have not been able to get the permit. So I think that's a great, I mean, a great, not a terrible threat of regulation, and that's something that we need to deal with. Having a bureaucracy that is sensitive to the traditional communities and is not about only permits and licenses that are just impossible for them to achieve. But in parallel to these permits, I think other issues as starting to develop models of share benefits are also important, because, for example, as I was saying, one of the things that have prevented with the prohibition is research about the properties of coca crops. And if those research is conducted only in the universities or pharmaceuticals without including traditional uh, communities, well, these benefits of the regulation are not going to go to those communities. So I think we need to develop a bureaucracy that is sensitive to the local realities, but also models of shared benefits for research that is being conducted right now. Otherwise, it's going to happen as is happening with the cannabis market in
Yeah.
Colombia and elsewhere. Mhm.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. This made me, both of your responses there really made me think about Spirit, your very first, in the start of your presentation, was the piece, was your, what you were saying about education, that as soon as the cannabis growers were included as a stakeholder in the reforestation program, then the consequence of that was that they learned about their environment, and it wasn't enforced. I can imagine that it wasn't imposed upon them, that actually naturally, when you begin to understand ecosystems and learn about your what you're a guardian of, or how to manage your land, then you naturally begin to want to do that. So I think it's another really strong yeah, that education is a consequence of inclusion and participation, and that's empowerment, and that really provides a true, honest experience for people, rather than being handed a license that you're never going to be able to afford to buy, therefore criminalizing you possibly further into this system. So I wonder if we've just got enough time. What's one quick question from Zara Snap, maybe just as an example, would it be, does anybody have an example of a industry or an industry or a form of agriculture that maintains good environmental standards? Like what could we, as advocates for the environment and drug policy reform, is there something that's of good practice? Go on. Yes, Maria.
I think a quick example, there are many, but I think there is a lot of industries that are doing things well. For example, in Colombia, I think that coffee and certain ways of cultivating coffee are doing the correct thing. So I think, I mean, we have to eat, right? And there is a lot of agricultural production that is done in a correctly way. So right now I'm thinking about coffee because it's the one that I know, and there is a lot of labels that certify that this coffee is produced in a sustainable way. And we have in the university, for example, measured the impacts of Rainforest Alliance labels or such a thing like that. And you indeed have an impact, important impact in forest cover and other practices. And I think Katie also could mention more, I think. But I think coffee is a good example of an agricultural product that it could be done in a correct way.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time, really. Do any of the panelists have any reflections that they would like to make to one another?
Just to say that we as panelists must, it is important that we build a network. You know, I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, that this is not just a national struggle. It's an international struggle. Those who are trying to, the big corporations, they are international hosts, and they work together in the same vein. We have to build this international network. It reminds me like the Vietnam War and the peace movement, that it wasn't just the internal struggle that brought a conclusion, but the solidarity that was extended to the national forces. And that is critical, that international bond and international solidarity. And I think it's one of the things that we have to look at. Forums like these are very important if we are to successfully battle this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Spirit. Thank you. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you. What a brilliant webinar this has been, and fantastic conversations. I think it's very clear from today that the environment urgently needs to be central to all legal regulation, and that drugs policy reform also does need to be placed on the environmental agenda. We believe collectively, the organisations that have put this webinar on, that it is time to build a new approach to drugs that prioritises, promotes and protects health and well-being, helps address poverty and inequality. We've heard a lot about this today, and contributes to achieving the development goals. I think runaway climate change, I mean, this is one of the biggest things of our generation, and where we can, we need to move fast. It feels that yes, it would be great to see more collaborative working between these two areas, these two different intersections. So that brings us to the end of today. We've been working with a university, Queen Mary's University in London, and we've developed two participatory online activities. Tess and I, who've been putting together these webinars, have found it very hard to not be able to be in a room with everybody during these conversations. So we've designed two interactive exercises to really glean more information from you, but also your thoughts and maybe different geographical contexts of where you're working or where you live regarding drugs and drug policy. So we can really build on that. Our final webinar is the 16th of December, and this is, after our conversations today, this is possibly the most important conversation for us to have, and that is about community participation and legal regulation. How do we ensure that impacted communities play a leading role, not just a consultation, but a leading role in these policies that impact them? So do join us, that's on the 16th of December at 15:30 GMT time. Do spread the word to colleagues and networks. This will be recorded, so I'll spam you all with this video tomorrow. So thank you for joining us all. Once again, thank you so much to our panelists for taking the time. They are professionals and activists, and I really appreciate how much time it takes to put something like this together. So thank you very, very much. And thank you for joining us. We do hope that these conversations have been food for thought, and you can take them back to your places of work and families and friends, and spread this discussion, so that the environment is not a consequence of the future of any policy. Okay, thank you very much, and good evening to all of you.
Thank you.